The city was still shaking off the last vestiges of night when my phone buzzed, a summons I'd learned to expect at the most inconvenient hours. A bioengineering lab, Dr. Aris Thorne, deceased. My gut tightened, not from dread, but from that familiar prickle of anticipation. Another puzzle dropped into my lap. The GPS guided me through the city's older districts, past the skeletal remains of what used to be the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. Its crumbling facade, a testament to forgotten suffering, stood in stark contrast to the sleek, almost futuristic building that was my destination. The old place always gave me a shiver, a reminder of secrets buried deep. But today, a different kind of secret called. Thorne's research facility, Aethera Labs, gleamed under the nascent morning sun, a monument of glass and polished steel. It looked impenetrable, designed to keep secrets in, not let them out in a cloud of smoke and ash. Yet as I pulled into the cordoned-off parking lot, the faint, acrid scent of ozone and burnt plastic already hung in the air, a chemical ghost announcing the chaos within. The lead detective, a no-nonsense type with tired eyes, met me at the entrance. "Reed, glad you're here, this one's messy." He gestured towards the building. "Dr. Thorne, brilliant, they say, reclusive, definitely, apparent lab accident or suicide. Take your pick. Everything points to it being contained to his personal research module." "Understood," I said, already donning my full-body hazard suit, the sterile fabric rustling as I moved. My mind was already sifting through the limited information, forming preliminary hypotheses, but mostly just clearing the slate. I preferred to let the scene speak for itself. Stepping through the shattered remains of a reinforced door, the world inside shifted. The pristine, clinical aesthetic of Aethera Labs had been violently ripped apart. The air was thick, heavy with the metallic tang of burnt circuitry and the cloying sweetness of something organic, now charred beyond recognition. My eyes scanned the devastation. Twisted metal, shattered glass, scorched walls. It wasn't just an explosion, it was a focused detonation. A surgical strike of destruction confined to Thorne's advanced research module within the larger lab. The module itself was a crater of blackened debris. Workstations were overturned, their complex displays melted into grotesque abstract art. Vials, once filled with precious, potentially world-changing compounds, were now shards of glass mixed with indefinable sludge. It was a scene of utter, brutal finality. And then I saw him. His body lay amidst the wreckage, surprisingly intact compared to the surrounding destruction, but undeniably lifeless. He was positioned near what looked like the remnants of a specialized bioreactor, his lab coat singed, his face frozen in an expression I couldn't quite decipher: surprise, pain, resignation. The detective was right, it screamed accident, or perhaps a deliberate act of self-destruction. The setup, the high-security environment, Thorne's reclusive nature, it all fit the profile of a genius who might push boundaries too far, or simply decide to end it all amidst his life's work. I began my systematic sweep, my eyes tracking every detail from the largest piece of debris to the smallest speck of dust. My camera clicked, documenting the broad strokes of the devastation. I moved slowly, methodically, ignoring the detective's impatient shuffling. He saw a closed case. I saw a canvas of chaos waiting to reveal its secrets. The scorch marks on the floor and walls were severe, radiating outwards from the bioreactor's presumed location. Classic explosion pattern, but something snagged my attention near a workstation about 5 feet from Thorne's body. A small, almost pristine section of the counter, shielded by what must have been a blast barrier, showed a peculiar anomaly. A faint, almost iridescent sheen clung to the surface of a fractured ceramic tile. It wasn't the dull soot of the explosion, nor the greasy residue of burnt plastic. It was brighter, almost crystalline, reflecting the weak overhead lights in a way that felt alien to the general destruction. I knelt, my breath held. The sheen was concentrated in a tight, almost perfect circle, no bigger than my thumbprint. It was too clean, too precise, given the surrounding chaos. My gaze drifted from the peculiar residue to a fragment of what looked like a shattered safety panel, embedded in the wall behind the workstation. The edges of the fracture were peculiar. Instead of the typical jagged breaks of an explosion, these were smooth, almost polished, as if something had cut through them with incredible precision before the main blast. My skepticism, a quiet hum moments ago, sharpened into a distinct, discordant note. A catastrophic accident, yes. A suicide, perhaps, but this wasn't just a miscalculation. This wasn't just a genius gone rogue. This was too neat in its destruction, too specific in its details. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make this look like an accident. And they had almost succeeded. Almost. Stepping through the threshold of the lab felt like entering a different dimension. The air, thick with the metallic tang of ozone and something acrid, pressed in on me even through the hazard suit's filters. The interior was a chaotic tableau of twisted metal, shattered glass, and carbonized debris. A massive explosion had ripped through this space, leaving behind a testament to its raw power. The central research console, once a gleaming hub of advanced technology, was now a mangled sculpture of melted circuits and blackened screens. I moved slowly, methodically, my eyes scanning every surface, every shadow. The initial assessment from the emergency responders had been catastrophic accident, possibly a pressure vessel breach, given the structural damage and the sheer force involved. But even amidst the devastation, patterns began to emerge. The main blast radius was centered around Thorne's workstation, that much was clear. However, the dispersion of certain materials, particularly the microscopic iridescent flecks scattered across the floor in a peculiar radial pattern, suggested something more complex than a simple pressure failure. A standard explosion tends to scatter debris somewhat uniformly. This felt almost directed. My gaze settled on Thorne. His body lay sprawled near the remnants of a specialized bioreactor, partially obscured by a fallen ceiling panel. The heat had been intense, charring his lab coat and skin in places, but the burns weren't uniform. There was a specific, almost surgical cauterization around his left wrist, starkly different from the broader, more diffuse thermal damage elsewhere. I knelt, my gloved fingers hovering over the scene. A small, dark stain on the floor beneath him. Not quite blood, but something viscous and strangely shimmering caught my attention. I carefully collected a sample, along with fragments of the scorched lab coat and the peculiar iridescent flecks. This wasn't just an accident. My gut tightened. The pathologist, a no-nonsense individual with a perpetually tired expression, peeled back the sheet from Thorne's body. Preliminary findings align with massive trauma from an explosion, the pathologist stated, gesturing with a scalpel. Severe internal injuries, blast lung, extensive burns. Time of death is consistent with the initial call. What about the burns on the wrist? I asked, pointing to the distinct cauterization I'd noticed. The pathologist leaned closer, examining the area. That's unusual, very localized, almost as if a specific energy source was applied there, not typical of a general blast wave. The skin around it is less damaged than other areas of similar exposure. And cause of death, I pressed. Multiple organ failure, massive internal hemorrhaging, shock, the pathologist recited. But they paused, looking up. There's something else. Trace amounts of a powerful neurotoxin in his system, not enough to be lethal on its own, but certainly enough to incapacitate or disorient him right before the blast. It's a synthetic compound, very sophisticated, nothing we've seen in our usual toxicology screens. A neurotoxin. My suspicions solidified. This wasn't an accident. Someone had ensured Thorne was vulnerable. Back in my own lab, the microscopic examination of the samples I'd collected from Thorne's body, and the scene began to yield more specific answers. The iridescent flecks turned out to be microscopic shards of a rare, high-density ceramic, not typically used in Thorne's bioreactor or any standard lab equipment. And then there was the sample from Thorne's charred lab coat. Amidst the carbonized fibers, I isolated something truly out of place. A cluster of unique fungal spores, Aspergillus restrictus, a species known for thriving in dry, enclosed environments, often associated with old paper and neglected archives. Alongside them were distinctive cellulose fibers from aged, acid-free paper, not the bleached wood pulp of modern documents. This wasn't lab contamination. This wasn't office dust. This was a signature. We've got 2 initial persons of interest, the lead detective, a burly man named Miller, told me over the phone later that evening. Dr. Silas Vance, a rival bioengineer. Thorne recently outmaneuvered him for a major grant, apparently. Vance has a history of aggressive tactics, a real cutthroat. And then there's Maya, a former research assistant. Thorne fired her a few months back. He was apparently quite vocal about feeling exploited, claimed Thorne stole her ideas. I listened, my mind already sifting through the information. Rivalry and revenge, classic motives. Any alibis for Vance or Maya around the time of the incident? Still checking. Vance claims he was at a conference across town. Maya says he was home, sick, nothing airtight yet. What about Thorne's personal life? Any known eccentricities? Hobbies that might involve old buildings or archives? I asked, my thoughts on the fungal spores and unique paper fibers. The detective chuckled dryly. Thorne was as reclusive as they come, lived for his work, had a small, meticulously organized apartment. No known hobbies beyond obscure scientific journals, but actually now that you mention it, his assistant did mention he'd been making some unusual inquiries lately. Something about historical patent filings, and he'd requested access to some very old institutional records. Said it was for a side project unrelated to his main research. Any specific location for these records? She wasn't sure, just that he'd been frustrated with the bureaucratic red tape involved. But I think she mentioned something about a city archive or an old medical facility that kept its own historical records. The pieces began to click into place. The neurotoxin, the peculiar burn, the ceramic shards, and now the unique trace elements pointing to an old, neglected environment. And Thorne's own recent inquiries. "Detective," I said, a determined edge in my voice, "I think our killer went to great lengths to cover their tracks, but they missed something. I need to know every possible location Thorne might have tried to access. Reed, are you sure about this?" "I'm sure," I replied, already pulling up city archives and historical building permits on my tablet. "It's where the next clue is waiting." The city archives, a cavernous space smelling of dust and forgotten paper, was exactly where I expected to be. The previous night, a quick cross-reference of Thorne's lab address against historical zoning maps had flagged an anomaly. A small, almost insignificant parcel of land adjacent to the current lab site that had once belonged to a different entity entirely. Not a corporation, not an individual, but an institution. My tablet hummed, displaying a faded blueprint from the late 1960s. That's when the name jumped out at me, scrawled in an architect's neat hand. Northern Peak Psychiatric Hospital Annex B. A psychiatric hospital. Not a bank, not a factory, but a place of confinement and treatment. What possible connection could Thorne, the meticulous bioengineer, have to such a place? I spent another hour poring over microfiche, the projector whirring softly, until I found it a series of property transfers from the hospital's defunct foundation to a private trust, then eventually to the corporation that built Thorne's lab. The trust itself was a shell, but buried in the fine print was a name. Thorne Elias, Dr. Aris Thorne's grandfather. The pieces clicked with an unsettling quietness. This wasn't just about a building permit, it was about history, about family. The abandoned wing of the old psychiatric hospital was a 20-minute drive out of the city, nestled among overgrown pines. The air grew colder as I approached, the silence pressing in. The main building was a decaying monolith, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from a crumbling face. I bypassed the main entrance, following the faded path to what the blueprints called Annex B. It was smaller, a two-story structure half hidden by ivy, its bricks stained with decades of neglect. The door, once heavy steel, hung ajar on a single rusted hinge, groaning a welcome as the wind pushed it open further. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Sunlight struggled through grime-coated windows, casting long, distorted shadows across peeling linoleum floors. Most rooms were empty, stripped bare, but one on the ground floor marked records still held skeletal metal shelving. Files, water-damaged and brittle, lay scattered like fallen leaves. I pulled on a pair of latex gloves and began to sift through them. Patient intake forms, treatment logs, discharge papers, a litany of forgotten lives. Most were illegible, but then I found a section, neatly bound despite the decay, labeled Research and Development Experimental Therapies. My fingers brushed against a thick, leather-bound ledger. The cover was blank, but inside, meticulous handwritten entries detailed various early-stage genetic sequencing trials, some involving human subjects, all conducted under the strict supervision of a doctor, Elias Thorne. The dates spanned from the late 1960s to the early 1980s. This wasn't just his grandfather's property, it was his grandfather's work. The records spoke of gene therapy for cognitive enhancement and targeted viral vectors for disease resistance. It was crude, ethically questionable by today's standards, but undeniably foundational to modern bioengineering. The final entry, dated 1982, simply read, "Project terminated. Data archived under secure protocol. All subjects relocated." Relocated? To where? The ledger offered no answers. Aris Thorne wasn't just a brilliant bioengineer. He was the inheritor of a legacy, one rooted in experimental human genetics. This changed everything. His current research suddenly felt less like a standalone endeavor and more like a continuation. This wasn't just about a lab accident. It was about history repeating itself, or perhaps a dangerous secret coming to light. I made my way back to Thorne's lab, the details from the old ledger swirling in my mind. The crime scene investigators had mostly cleared out, leaving the digital forensics team to finish their work. I found the lead digital analyst hunched over a workstation, lines of code scrolling across his screen. "Anything interesting?" I inquired, looking over his shoulder. He adjusted his glasses. "Well, Reed, depends on your definition of interesting. Thorne's main research servers are Fort Knox. Military-grade encryption, multi-layered firewalls. Took us hours just to get past the first few." He gestured to a complex network diagram. "But what we did find..." He paused, his expression grim. "It's a deep dive into advanced genetic sequencing, highly experimental. Looks like he was working on something big, something with implications far beyond typical medical research." "Global health or bioweaponry?" I offered, remembering the targeted viral vectors from the ledger. The analyst raised an eyebrow. "Could be either, frankly. The code suggests both therapeutic and potentially destructive applications depending on the modification. But here's the kicker. Someone tried to wipe specific project files, not just delete, but a sophisticated multi-pass overwrite. Very professional." My internal alarm bells started ringing. External access or Thorne himself? Hard to say definitively without more data, he admitted. "The access logs are a mess. Someone masked their tracks well. I want to know what those specific files contained." As I turned to leave, I spotted Maya, Thorne's assistant, sitting by herself in a quiet corner of the observation room, staring blankly at the floor. Her usually neat hair was disheveled, and her eyes were red-rimmed. She looked utterly lost. "Maya," I answered softly, approaching her. "How are you holding up?" She flinched, as if startled by my presence. Her gaze was distant, unfocused. It's just so much. He was so brilliant." "He was," I agreed. "Maya, can you tell me anything about Dr. Thorne's recent state of mind? He was different lately, paranoid, kept talking about them, said they were watching, trying to get his work. I didn't understand who he meant. He was so careful with the data, always encrypting, backing everything up off-site. But then he'd just stare at the screens, muttering about loose ends and making sure it was all gone." "Loose ends?" The attempted data wipe now took on a terrifying new dimension. She shook her head, tears welling again. "I don't know, he just wasn't himself. He was afraid, Reed. Thorne's paranoia, the sophisticated data manipulation, the historical connection to his grandfather's ethically dubious research, it all painted a picture far more complex and sinister than a simple lab accident. I had a killer, and now, a motive rooted in a decades-old secret. The tension in the room, in the very air, was palpable. The hum of the spectral analyzer was a lullaby to my focused mind. Days had blurred into a relentless pursuit of the impossible, a microscopic whisper of evidence I knew was there, hidden in the chaotic aftermath of Thorne's lab. The small, charred fragment, no bigger than a grain of rice, was clamped securely in the sample chamber. I adjusted the focus, the automated arm precisely positioning the laser. Each pulse of light was a question, probing the atomic structure, and I waited for the answer to ripple across the display. I leaned closer, my breath held, watching the data stream. The first pass revealed nothing conclusive, just a jumble of common elements. But I wasn't looking for common. I was looking for the outlier, the one component that didn't belong. I ran a secondary scan, targeting the less volatile compounds, pushing the machine to its limits. The display shimmered, a jagged peak blossoming on the screen, followed by another, then a series of distinct signatures. My eyes scanned the readouts, cross-referencing against a global database of known materials. It wasn't a natural compound. It wasn't even a standard industrial alloy. A single word solidified on the screen, then another, detailing its unique properties. A rare, synthetic polymer, remarkably resistant to extreme temperatures and corrosive agents. It was engineered for high-end industrial applications, the kind of material I'd find in aerospace components or specialized medical devices, not a bioengineering lab. My internal alarm bells began to clang. This wasn't something Thorne would have casually used, nor was it likely to be a byproduct of his biological experiments. This polymer was purpose-built, expensive, and difficult to acquire. The implications hit me with the force of a physical blow. A synthetic polymer, custom-made for resilience, it pointed away from a tragic accident or even a simple suicide. This was an engineered component, a piece of a puzzle I hadn't even recognized as missing. My mind immediately jumped to the corporations funding Thorne's research, particularly OmniCorp, a behemoth known for its aggressive R&D and its willingness to push boundaries. Their name had come up repeatedly in the preliminary reports, always as a primary financial backer. The polymer was a calling card, subtle but undeniable. I arranged a meeting with OmniCorp's corporate liaison that afternoon. The company's downtown offices were a study in polished steel and muted power, a stark contrast to the sterile chaos of Thorne's lab. The liaison, a man in a precisely tailored suit, met me in a meeting room with panoramic city views. He offered me artisanal coffee and an overly enthusiastic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Reed, it's truly a pleasure to finally meet you," he began, his voice smooth as polished marble. "OmniCorp is, of course, fully cooperating with the investigation. Dr. Thorne was a brilliant mind, a tragic loss for science and humanity." "I appreciate your cooperation," I responded, cutting to the chase. "I've identified a unique synthetic polymer at the scene. It's a specialized material, not something commonly found. Do you have any records of this particular polymer being used in OmniCorp's projects, especially those related to Dr. Thorne's research?" His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in the facade. "A polymer, you say? Fascinating. OmniCorp, as you know, invests heavily in material science. We have thousands of proprietary compounds. Could you be more specific?" I provided the spectral analysis details, watching him closely. He listened, nodding slowly, his fingers steepled on the table. "I see. Yes, this sounds like a high-density, bioresistant composite. We do indeed develop such materials. However, I can't immediately recall any direct application in Dr. Thorne's specific project. His focus was biological, not material engineering." "But OmniCorp's broader R&D portfolio," I pressed. "Could it have been a component in equipment supplied by OmniCorp, perhaps for the lab's security system or even a research apparatus?" He paused, a practiced, thoughtful expression on his face. "Certainly possible. Our subsidiaries manufacture a vast array of cutting-edge equipment. I would need to consult our internal databases, cross-reference the specifics. Rest assured, I will initiate that search immediately. We want to assist in any way we can." He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "In fact, I've already compiled a comprehensive dossier of all OmniCorp's interactions with Dr. Thorne, including funding reports, project milestones, and even his personal requests for specialized equipment. It's all here." He slid a thick binder across the table. The dossier was impressive in its completeness, almost too much so. It felt like an attempt to overwhelm me with information, to bury any real answers under a mountain of data. His eagerness to provide everything without me even having to ask felt less like cooperation and more like a carefully orchestrated diversion. He was giving me what he wanted me to see, not necessarily what I needed to see. My gut tightened. After leaving the polished corporate office, the city outside felt less bright, more shadowed. The liaison's performance had been masterful, but his forced affability, the way he'd glided around direct questions, only confirmed my suspicion. OmniCorp knew more than they were letting on. The polymer was a thread, and it led straight to them, but the thread felt deliberately tangled. I remembered the archivist's words about Thorne's grandfather, the ethically dubious research. A flash of an idea, a long shot, pulled me towards a different kind of archive. If OmniCorp was involved, if they had a history of aggressive R&D, perhaps their past was as tangled as their present. And if Thorne's grandfather's work was controversial, it might have left traces in places designed to forget. The address led me to the outskirts of the city, to a sprawling, ivy-choked structure that had once been a psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. The smell of dust, decay, and something indefinably metallic hit me first. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing rows of rusted filing cabinets, shelves overflowing with brittle paper, and overturned desks. This was where the city's forgotten stories came to rest, where the past was meant to slowly decompose into oblivion. I walked deeper, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the vast, empty space. I had a hunch, a nagging feeling that if OmniCorp had a long, aggressive history and Thorne's family had a history of ethically questionable research, there might be a connection buried in these forgotten files, a link that predated the sleek, modern offices downtown. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew it wouldn't be in the neatly compiled dossier I just received. It would be something far messier, far older, and far more revealing. The corporate executive's promise of an internal database search had been as thin as I'd expected. A week later, all I'd received was a bland email detailing a generic list of suppliers, none of which produced the specific polymer I'd found. It was a stonewall, elegantly disguised. But I'd already begun my own deep dive, poring over obscure material science journals and archived patents. My desk at the precinct was buried under printouts, each page an arrow pointing towards a specialized, almost forgotten manufacturing process from decades past. This polymer wasn't new, it was resurrected. I was crossing the street, heading to my car after another late night sifting through digital archives when the sedan roared. It came out of nowhere, a dark blur of an older model. No headlights on, engine whining. I heard it before I saw it, a sudden growl in the otherwise quiet street. My reflexes, honed by years of watching for the unexpected, kicked in. I lunged back, stumbling onto the curb, the vehicle missing my knee by inches. Air whooshed past, a blast of hot exhaust washing over me as it sped away, tires squealing faintly as it rounded the corner. No brake lights, no hesitation. I stood there for a moment, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, the residual adrenaline making my hands shake. It wasn't a random drunk. The speed, the deliberate swerve, the lack of lights, it felt too precise, too intentional. Someone was paying attention. Someone knew I was getting close. The polymer I'd discovered was a highly specialized, temperature-resistant compound. Its original application wasn't in cutting-edge bioengineering, but in a very specific type of medical sensor developed in the late 1970s for monitoring neurological activity in long-term care patients. A niche market, barely profitable, eventually abandoned. The company that pioneered it had long since gone bankrupt, its assets sold off piecemeal. But their research records, I'd found, had been absorbed by a state-run archive after a brief stint in a forgotten university library. And that archive was housed in the old, crumbling administrative block of what used to be the city's largest psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. The building itself was a monument to neglect. Broken windows stared like vacant eyes, and the air inside was thick with the scent of dust, mildew, and decay. Rust-colored streaks bled down the concrete walls, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. The records department, a cavernous space on the second floor, was marginally better. Fluorescent lights flickered erratically, buzzing with a desperate energy, illuminating rows of steel shelving packed with yellowed folders and dog-eared binders. I spent hours there, pulling dusty boxes, tracing the convoluted history of the polymer. It wasn't easy. Names had changed, companies had dissolved, patents had expired. But then, tucked away in a file labeled Experimental Materials Project Nightingale, I found it. A detailed breakdown of the polymer's composition, its unique properties, and a list of the few facilities that had ever acquired it in bulk. One name jumped out, Thorne Advanced Biosolutions. Not Dr. Thorne's current lab, but an earlier iteration, a smaller, almost forgotten venture from 2 decades ago. He'd been working with this specific compound for a very long time. This wasn't a new material for him, it was an old friend. And someone had used it to kill him. I left the abandoned hospital wing feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty building. The pieces were starting to connect, forming a picture far more sinister than a lab accident. Back at my own personal lab, a small, meticulously organized space I maintained for independent work, I noticed it immediately. The faint scent of ozone, almost imperceptible, clinging to the air around my workbench. I'd run a specific air purifier for weeks, and that smell was not from my equipment. Then the small ceramic mug I always left inverted over my spare data drive was subtly off-center. Not much, just a millimeter or two, but it was enough. My internal alarm bells screamed. Someone had been here. They hadn't taken anything obvious, hadn't disturbed anything critical, but they had been here. They had searched. For what, I couldn't say, but the message was clear. My investigation was being monitored. My space was no longer secure. The next morning, the assistant, Maya, found me in the precinct's break room. I have to tell I something. I should have said it sooner, but I was so scared. I put down my own mug, giving her my full attention. "What is it, Maya?" She wrung her hands. "Dr. Thorne, he was acting strange the last few weeks, distracted, jumpy, and I saw someone." She paused, glancing around the empty break room as if expecting to see an eavesdropper. "Late one night, about a week before it happened. I was just finishing up some paperwork, unusually late. The lab was supposed to be empty, but I saw a figure inside the main research bay. The lights were mostly off, just a low glow from the emergency exits, but I saw them. Tall, broad shoulders, they were, moving something, like a large crate or a piece of equipment. I didn't recognize them, not one of our usual staff. I just assumed Dr. Thorne had hired someone new for a special project, kept quiet about it. I went home, tried to forget it, but now, with everything, I keep thinking about it." His voice trembled, cracking on the last words. "Who was it, Reed, and what were they doing?" My mind raced. An unknown individual accessing Thorne's lab after hours, moving equipment just days before his death. The polymer, the near miss, the breach of my lab, and now Maya's terrified confession. I was being hunted. The city's hum felt distant, a muffled drone against the silence of the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records. Maya's confession, whispered and terrified, still echoed in my head. An unknown individual, moving equipment. My lab breached. The web wasn't just tightening, it was a noose, and I was dangerously close to being caught in its snare. I needed a place where I could think, where no one would look for me, where the ghosts were more predictable than the living. This wing, long since condemned and stripped of anything valuable, offered exactly that. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through grimy, gridded windows, illuminating paths across the linoleum floor. The air was thick with the scent of mildewed paper and forgotten sorrow. Stacked metal shelves, rusted and groaning under their load, lined the narrow corridors, overflowing with patient files, discharge summaries, and therapy notes from decades past. Each folder was a life story, now just decaying pulp. I'd set up my temporary command center in what must have been a doctor's office, a small, square room with a single battered desk and a chair that listed precariously to one side. My laptop hummed, its screen a stark, vibrant contrast to the sepia-toned decay around me. I pulled up the schematics of Thorne's lab, overlaying them with the environmental sensor data I'd managed to extract from the building management system. The sheer volume of information was staggering, a digital ocean of temperature logs, air pressure readings, humidity levels, and gas concentrations. Thorne, bless his meticulous heart, had instrumented his lab like a spacecraft. Every breath of air, every flicker of light was recorded, and somewhere in that deluge I knew was the truth. My fingers flew across the keyboard, filtering, correlating, cross-referencing. I started with the hours leading up to the incident, then expanded the timeline, chasing anomalies. The initial reports had focused on the catastrophic failure of the atmospheric containment system, followed by an uncontrolled release of Thorne's experimental compound. But I remembered the burn pattern, the microscopic polymer residue. Those details didn't fit a simple containment breach. An hour bled into 2, then 3. The only sound was the whir of my laptop's fan and the occasional groan of the old building settling. My eyes, accustomed to the dimness, registered the subtle shifts in the data. A spike in the ambient oxygen levels, then a rapid, controlled depletion. Not a leak, but a purge, a deliberate act. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the screen slightly. The system logs showed a series of access commands executed remotely, overriding Thorne's own safety protocols. Someone had gained root access, not just to the atmospheric controls, but to the integrated equipment management system. This wasn't a hack. It was an intimate understanding of the architecture, like someone who had built the house himself, or at least had been given the master keys. The sequence began subtle, almost imperceptible. First, a slight elevation in the lab's internal pressure, just enough to stress the seals of the containment unit holding Thorne's volatile compound. Then, a precise, calculated reduction of the oxygen scavenger system, usually a fail-safe. This would have created a localized pocket of highly reactive gas inside the containment unit, destabilizing the compound without triggering an immediate alarm. Clever, I muttered, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. This wasn't just about making the lab explode. It was about making it explode in a specific way, at a specific time, and with a specific signature. Next, the critical step, a remote command to initiate a rapid, high-frequency vibration sequence on the containment unit itself. This wasn't part of any standard protocol. It was a targeted destabilization. The pressure, the reactive gas, the vibration, it was a meticulously orchestrated ballet of destruction. I visualized it, the scene playing out in my mind's eye like a gruesome, slow-motion film. Thorne, likely engrossed in his work, perhaps noting a minor anomaly on his console, but unsuspecting. The subtle changes in his environment, too slow to register as an immediate threat. Then the cascade. The containment unit weakened and primed, succumbing to the final vibrational stress. The compound, now volatile beyond its intended parameters, rupturing the containment. But it still wasn't enough for the scale of the destruction. The final piece clicked into place as I cross-referenced the environmental logs with the electrical system's power consumption. A sudden, massive power surge, not from an external source, but from within the lab's own power grid, rerouted and focused. This surge, precisely timed with the containment breach, would have ignited the now-dispersed compound, creating the flash fire, the impossible burn pattern, and the illusion of a spontaneous, catastrophic accident. The killer didn't just trigger an explosion. They engineered a specific type of explosion, one that looked exactly like Thorne's groundbreaking research going catastrophically wrong. They knew his protocols, his compounds, his lab's bespoke systems, and even the subtle vulnerabilities in his designs. This wasn't a random hit. This was a surgical strike, executed by someone who knew Thorne's work better than anyone, perhaps even better than Thorne himself. My gaze drifted across the room past the glowing screen to the decaying records. Each file represented a mind, a life, a story. Thorne's story had just taken a terrifying turn, and I was smack in the middle of it. The killer was an insider, someone with deep knowledge and even deeper malice. And they were still out there, watching, waiting. This wasn't just about solving a murder anymore. It was about confronting a ghost that knew all the secrets. An unknown individual, moving equipment. My lab breached. The web wasn't just tightening, it was a noose, and I was starting to feel the knot against my throat. I stood in the dusty corridor, the smell of mildew and forgotten lives clinging to the peeling wallpaper. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, dancing over the skeletal remains of patient chairs and overturned filing cabinets. Maya's words. He added he was moving equipment for Thorne, something about a secure off-site location, played on repeat. Secure off-site location. Thorne, meticulous and paranoid, wouldn't just leave crucial research lying around, and he certainly wouldn't trust just anyone with it. The unknown individual wasn't just a mover, they were complicit, or worse, the architect. The complexity of Thorne's death had always bothered me. It wasn't just a lab accident, not with the microscopic trace of a unique accelerant, the peculiar burn pattern. It was too precise, too carefully orchestrated to look like an explosion, yet leave specific evidence intact. A simple theft of research data wouldn't require such an elaborate charade, not when a simple hack or a discrete physical transfer could suffice. No, this killer wanted to do more than steal. They wanted to erase. Erase Thorne, erase his work, and erase the potential of his work ever seeing the light of day. They wanted to prevent its completion, its public release. That was the missing piece, the motive that elevated this from corporate espionage to something far more sinister. My gaze swept over the shelves of ancient medical records, thick with dust and forgotten patient histories. This place was a mausoleum of secrets, a perfect place to hide one more. If Thorne had a contingency plan, a way to safeguard his most sensitive discoveries, it would be here, amidst the chaos of neglect. He was a man who planned for every eventuality, especially betrayal. I started sifting through the records, pulling out crumbling folders, their contents a jumble of faded ink and diagnostic notes. Moving equipment, Maya had said. Not just data, but physical components. What kind of equipment would need to be moved to an abandoned psychiatric hospital? Something small enough to hide, perhaps, but critical. My fingers brushed against a thick leather-bound ledger, distinct from the flimsy patient files. It was tucked behind a stack of pathology reports from the 1970s, almost as if someone had tried to make it look like part of the inventory. The ledger was old, its cover worn smooth, but the spine was surprisingly intact. I pulled it free, my flashlight beam illuminating the title, faintly embossed, Maintenance Log Wing C. It was dated, but the handwriting was too neat, too modern to belong to the hospital's original staff, and beneath the official-looking title, almost imperceptible, was a small, crudely etched T. Thorne. My pulse quickened. This wasn't a log, it was a decoy. I flipped through the first few pages' generic entries about boiler checks and light bulb replacements. But then, midway through, the paper quality changed slightly, and the entries became a series of alphanumeric codes. My gut clenched. This was it. I found a small, almost invisible compartment built into the back cover, secured with a tiny, complex latch. My utility knife, usually reserved for opening evidence bags, became a delicate pry tool. The latch clicked open with a faint sigh of aged metal. Inside, nestled in a velvet lining, was a sleek military-grade solid-state drive, no bigger than my thumb. Back in my temporary evidence processing unit, a cramped, borrowed office at the precinct, I plugged the drive into my secure forensic workstation. The drive was heavily encrypted, as expected. Thorne hadn't just put up a firewall, he'd built a fortress. It took hours, a grueling test of my decryption software and my own patience, but eventually the layers began to peel away. The screen flickered, and a directory tree populated. One folder stood out, Project Chimera Ethical Concerns and Exposure Protocol. My breath hitched. This wasn't just about Thorne's groundbreaking research. This was about something else entirely. I opened the folder. Inside were a series of journal entries, dated and meticulously logged, written in Thorne's unmistakable, precise prose. Entry 237, October 14th. The pressure from OmniCorp is escalating. They've gone beyond mere funding for my project. Their clandestine support for the Aegis initiative is deeply troubling. My initial assumptions were naive. They aren't interested in curing disease, they are interested in control and weaponization. Aegis is not a therapeutic application. It's a bioagent, a designer pathogen, and they are pushing its development with terrifying speed. My eyes scanned further, each word a hammer blow. Entry 241, November 1st. I've compiled irrefutable evidence. OmniCorp is leveraging my research, twisting its principles to create a delivery system for Aegis. My work intended for healing is being corrupted into a tool for mass destabilization. I cannot allow this. I plan to release everything. The data, the funding trails, the internal memos. The world needs to know what they are truly building and what they intend to unleash. Entry 245, November 10th. I've initiated the exposure protocol. The dead man's switch is active. If anything happens to me, the data will be released automatically. My life's work, my integrity, demands this. Thorne hadn't been murdered for his research. He'd been murdered to prevent the exposure of OmniCorp's other project, Project Aegis, a weaponized pathogen. The realization hit me like a physical punch. This wasn't just a corporate secret, it was a global threat. The killer wasn't just protecting stolen intellectual property. They were protecting a conspiracy that could redefine warfare. And I, Reed, had just stumbled into the very heart of it. They were watching, waiting. And they knew I had Thorne's secret. The air in the psychiatric hospital abandoned wing with old records hung thick and still, smelling of forgotten paper and institutional decay. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through grimy, barred windows, each speck a tiny, irritating reminder of the passage of time, of secrets settling. I'd hauled my laptop and a portable scanner up 3 flights of stairs, past peeling paint and doors that groaned on rusted hinges, to this forgotten corner. It was a bizarre place to be hunting for a killer operating at the cutting edge of bioengineering, but the digital trail had gone cold, and I needed to cast a wider net, a deeper net. OmniCorp's digital archives were too clean, too curated. I suspected the real story lay in the detritus, the forgotten physical records that hadn't been deemed important enough to digitize or perhaps important enough to bury. My fingers, smudged with fine grit, navigated through stacks of yellowed folders, each one a testament to lives lived and documented, then filed away. This wasn't just a records room. It felt like a mausoleum of forgotten bureaucratic lives. I was cross-referencing OmniCorp's initial employee profiles, the ones from decades ago, before the company became the monolithic entity it was today, with the access logs I'd managed to extract from Thorne's lab. It was painstaking work, a slow crawl through a labyrinth of names, dates, and innocuous job titles. My goal was to find overlap, to identify individuals with both the foundational technical skills that might have evolved into the sophisticated expertise needed for the sabotage, and some historical tie to OmniCorp that predated its current impenetrable security protocols. The first pass was broad, eliminating dozens of names. Most were scientists, engineers, administrative staff people whose careers had followed a predictable trajectory. They had the technical chops, perhaps, but lacked the specific, almost surgical precision I'd seen in the lab. The destruction wasn't random. It was designed to look like an accident while obscuring a very specific truth. It required someone who understood not just the science, but the art of misdirection. Someone who could dismantle without leaving a trace of intent. My focus narrowed to a handful of individuals who had been with OmniCorp since its formative years, people who had seen the company shift from a nimble startup to a corporate giant. I pulled up their early personnel files, looking for anything anomalous, gaps in employment, unusual career changes, educational backgrounds that didn't quite align with their stated roles. It was like sifting through sand for grains of gold, each file a heavy weight in my hands, smelling faintly of mildew. Then I found it, tucked away in a file marked Security and Liaison Personnel Historical. I saw the OmniCorp liaison's name. I remembered him from the initial scene, calm, almost too composed. He'd been present, observing, offering assistance that felt more like subtle oversight. My gut had prickled then, a faint unease I hadn't been able to place. Now, in this dusty room, the pieces began to click into place with an unsettling rhythm. His early employment records didn't start with OmniCorp. There was a period before, a blank space of several years, followed by a series of references to specialized government contracts and consulting roles in high-risk environments. The language was veiled, almost deliberately vague, but the implications were clear. Covert operations. My breath hitched. This wasn't a corporate drone, this was a ghost, a shadow, the kind of person who knew how to disappear, how to make things disappear. Digging deeper, I found a faded interdepartmental memo from an internal investigation almost 2 decades ago. It was an archived security report detailing a major breach involving stolen intellectual property from a rival biotech firm. The report itself was inconclusive, blaming external actors, but a handwritten note in the margin, almost illegible, mentioned an internal asset with unusual access. And there, next to it was an initial, faint but undeniably familiar. The OmniCorp liaison's initial. This wasn't just about a lab accident or a corporate secret. It wasn't a scientist trying to hide a mistake. It was an operative trying to bury a truth. The OmniCorp liaison wasn't just a suspect. He was becoming the prime suspect, the weaponized pathogen. The stakes had just escalated from corporate espionage to something far more dangerous. I wasn't just hunting a killer. I was hunting a ghost with a global threat in his pocket. The tension in the room, already thick, suddenly felt suffocating. I had found my inside man. Now I just had to prove it, and quickly, before Project Aegis became more than just a name in a forgotten file. I ran a gloved hand over the spine of a mildewed ledger, the cover cracking under my touch. This place was perfect. Isolated, forgotten, and teeming with a history no one cared to look at anymore except me. And I hoped David Thorne. I'd left the bait on a scarred wooden table near the far wall, a carefully constructed fabrication. It was a digital tablet left open, displaying a fabricated report detailing a breakthrough in Aris Thorne's research. Not just any breakthrough, but one specifically tailored to sound like I'd stumbled upon the true purpose of his final project, something that hinted at a self-replicating, highly stable biological agent. A detail so obscure, so specific to the real work Aris was doing, that only someone intimately involved, or someone tasked with suppressing it, would understand its true significance. I'd even highlighted a fictional discovery of an inert, stabilizing polymer within the system, a polymer that to the right ears would scream bioweapon component. My heart wasn't pounding. It was a steady, deliberate drumbeat, a rhythm of anticipation. I'd been working on this for days, refining the lure, ensuring it was irresistible. I'd accidentally mentioned to a colleague within earshot of a known OmniCorp informant that I was making significant progress, that Thorne's last notes were finally yielding answers that could change everything. I knew the whispers would reach David. He was too deeply embedded, too desperate to protect whatever secret he was holding. I heard the creak of the floorboards behind me, a sound too deliberate to be the building settling. I didn't turn immediately, instead pretending to be absorbed in a faded patient file, its yellowed pages whispering stories of forgotten lives. He looked impeccably dressed, as always, a stark contrast to the decay around us. His eyes, however, held a flicker of something I hadn't seen before, a predatory alertness. Just trying to connect the dots, David. Aris left a lot of loose ends. I gestured vaguely towards the open tablet on the table. Some of them are proving, illuminating. He glanced at the tablet, a momentary hesitation in his posture, then he was moving a little too quickly towards the table. What exactly have I found? His voice was tighter now. Oh, just some interesting parallels, I replied, my voice carefully neutral, watching him. He was closer to the tablet now, his gaze fixed on the screen on the fabricated report. I saw the muscles in his jaw clench as he read the highlighted section about the stabilizing polymer. This was it. The bait was taken. Suddenly he lunged, his hand reaching for the tablet. This is highly sensitive research, Reed. I shouldn't be tampering with it. I was faster. My hand shot out, grabbing his wrist before he could touch the device, or exposing David. I tightened my grip. You came here to destroy this, didn't you? Because you know exactly what that stabilizing polymer implies. He tried to yank his arm free, but I held firm. I don't know what you're talking about. This is nonsense. Is it? I released his wrist, but stepped between him and the tablet, because I've spent weeks meticulously cataloging every microscopic trace from Aris's lab. And do you know what I found, David? A unique polymer, almost invisible to the naked eye, a specific molecular structure that Aris was experimenting with. It was everywhere in his workspace, particularly concentrated around his primary research console. His face was a mask, but I saw the subtle shift in his eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening around his mouth. So what? Labs have all sorts of materials. They do, I agreed, my voice low, but not this one, not this specific polymer, because I also found it at 3 other accident scenes, David. 3 other unfortunate incidents where individuals working on similar bioengineering projects met untimely ends. Individuals whose research, if made public, would have inconveniently interfered with OmniCorp's less ethical ventures. I watched him, letting the words sink in. He was trapped. The air in the dusty room crackled with the unspoken. The same polymer, I continued, was also found embedded in the scorch marks on Aris's lab floor, and traces were even present on the residual burns on his body. It's a signature, David, your signature. I pulled a small, clear evidence bag from my coat pocket. Inside was a tiny, almost invisible fleck. This was recovered from the sole of your shoe, from the day you visited Aris's lab after his death. A perfect match. He stared at the bag, then at me, his carefully constructed composure finally crumbling. He slumped against the table, the old wood groaning under his weight. You don't understand, Reed. He took a ragged breath, the institutional decay of the wing seeming to press in on him. Aris, he was close to perfecting it. A bioweapon. He called it a universal pathogen vector, capable of delivering targeted genetic modifications. OmniCorp wanted it, but Aris, he had a conscience. He realized the implications, the potential for catastrophic misuse. My gut clenched. I had suspected something far worse than a simple corporate secret, but this. OmniCorp couldn't allow that. Not with billions invested, not with the potential to dominate the global defense market. They gave me an ultimatum: neutralize him, or my own family would face consequences. He swallowed hard. I was tasked with making it look like an accident, a lab explosion, a miscalculation. I used the stabilizing polymer to enhance the reaction, to ensure complete destruction of the primary research, and to leave a false signature of a volatile compound. The same polymer I'd used to clean up the other loose ends for them. I thought it was foolproof. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I had the truth, the full, horrifying truth. And David Thorne, his own brother, was the instrument of his demise, twisted by fear and coercion.